We are now turning in our course to a more focused, a more specific topic. We've been talking about Christianity as a worldview. We've been talking about the biblical worldview and how that's roughly synonymous with Christianity. And we've been talking about sort of all of the major themes and elements within that worldview. And here we're going to sort of zero in. We're going to zero in and take a deep dive into a particular part of that worldview. And one way to think of this is we're going to be looking at humans as the image of God and what it is to be a good human versus a bad human. And the way we're going to approach this is we're going to approach it from the side of features of humans that ruin them. Features of humans that destroy them. Habits, behaviors, emotions, thoughts, desires, loves that destroy. That's sort of what we're going to do it, but we're going to be doing it sort of always keeping this in mind that the goal is to use our understanding of the things that destroy so that we might turn to Christ, cling to Christ, and become better. And have a better picture of what our ultimate restoration will be like. And this can also give us a better picture of who Jesus is, since Jesus is the perfect human. This will give us a picture into what he is not and what he is. Now, in previous lectures, we were given all sorts of reasons for believing that morality is objective. That is, there can be good and bad actions and good and bad people, and it's not up to us to create or invent what counts as what. We don't determine what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. We have to discover what it is that makes an action or a person good or bad. The book that we turn to now is going to help us do that, help us in that discovery process. We're going to put some flesh on the abstract bones of the idea that morality is objective. Well, what does that look like in the concrete, in the flesh? We're now moving from abstract truths about morality, that morality is objective, that it's universal, that it's absolute, to more concrete facts about what makes us good or bad people. And to do that, we need the wisdom of history. As Dr. DeYoung notes right at the beginning of our book, Glittering Vices, she says this, she says, an honest look at our intellectual history requires that we listen carefully to the wisdom of the past. As we do this, right, we're going to encounter, we're going to see a richness when it comes to thinking about morality or ethics, when it comes to thinking about the various sins and diseases of our heart and spirit. We're going to encounter a richness that maybe we had no idea existed. And one way to think about this is in the act of naming. This history that we're going to encounter is rich with names. We're not even going to encounter 10%, 15% of all of the names that are the terms that are involved in this intellectual Christian history that we're going to get a glimpse of. Remember I said, right, in the garden, one of the primary tasks given to Adam and Eve was to name the creation. Naming matters. Naming is important, right? Naming can help us get at the root of something, or naming can really hurt us if we misname, right? Think about it like this. According to the tradition that we're going to encounter, you can have one act type that results from very different roots. So here's an example. I might lie and you might lie, and yet the roots of our lying might be very different. So we need to be careful when diagnosing and remedying our spiritual and moral diseases. We got to be careful about the terms that we use, about identifying what the cause of our lying is. I might lie because I'm desperate for approval. And you might lie because you're desperate for stuff. Those have very different roots. And so treating my lie as identical with your lie might actually result in not treating me at all. Here's another analogy. Suppose you're a doctor and you see a rash on Bob's arm, and you think it might be an allergic reaction to soap. Whereas a very similar rash, let's say, on Jane's arm is something much more serious. Maybe it's a sign of cancer or something. Now, if the doctor gets the diagnosis wrong, if you get the diagnosis wrong, very serious problems may result, even death. Right? Suppose you look at Bob's rash, which is actually an allergic reaction to soap, and you diagnose it as a sign of cancer. And suppose you look at Jane's rash, which is actually a sign of cancer, and you diagnose it as an allergic reaction to soap. In both cases, serious damage will result. When we misname, when we misidentify, when we misdiagnose, the consequences can be tragic. The same is true, I think actually even more true, more serious, when we are dealing with our moral and spiritual issues. We need correct diagnoses to apply the correct and most adequate treatments. Ultimately, in order to do this, we got to know what humans most fundamentally are. We have to know what humans' ultimate purpose is in order to determine what features humans need to have to be excellent. And such knowledge is also needed to know what features destroy us. Think about it like this. If we get the nature of humans wrong, then we're going to get what it takes to be a good human wrong. And we're going to get what actions and habits actually harm us wrong. We're going to make mistakes all over the place. We need to learn how to name our problems correctly. We need to learn how to name the symptoms, to name their root causes. And in so doing, we will be able to better apply the appropriate remedies. By neglecting this historical rich tradition, we've neglected, the proper identification of various diseases and the proper cures of them. By confusing vices with other things, we run the risk of confusing our sins with other things. This should all sound very familiar, right? Think about it like this. If I can call my sin something else, if I can name it something else, then maybe I can treat it as though it's not really sin. Calling it, naming it some other thing can make me feel like, can make me believe, can make me act as though what is actually sin isn't. This neglect of the tradition of properly identifying, diagnosing, and treating our spiritual sins and diseases has serious consequences. We no longer take sin seriously. And as a result, we no longer know how to deal with it in the best ways possible. The idea is this. Our not taking sin seriously is revealed in the fact that we have 10 terms that we apply to every single solitary disease, spiritual, moral ailment, sickness that affects us. And so that limits the way we can treat those in our care and even ourselves. And the idea here is also this: sin is a big deal. It's a bigger deal than our physical diseases, our physical illnesses. Sin destroys in ways that those just can't, because sin destroys our person, our essence. Now, the vice tradition, the tradition we are now going to study, this tradition took sin very seriously. What is a vice? Well, a vice and its counterpart, which is a virtue, a vice is first of all a habit. It's a character trait. Unlike something we are born with, such as like an outgoing personality or a predisposition to have high cholesterol, virtues and vices are acquired moral qualities or traits. We cultivate them, right, by doing things habitually. Or we can break them down over time by doing other things repeatedly. And so we are ultimately then responsible for our character. It's really important to emphasize, though, that the vices are habits, right? They're acquired through repeated practices. And you gotta get this. Vices necessarily destroy their possessor. That's what it is. That's part of the nature, part of the essence of a vice, is to necessarily destroy whatever has it. So, if we're trying to figure out, is this thing really a vice? One way of doing so is trying to figure out, does this thing destroy its possessor? If it doesn't, then it can't be a vice. Let me give you some examples of sort of this idea that vices are habits, vices are acquired, sort of deeply implanted character traits. In the book, you got the sledding example. I like to give an example I'm more familiar with since I hate and despise the snow. Think of an example from sports, right? So, those of you who play baseball or volleyball or soccer or golf or basketball or whatever, right? What do you need to do in order to become a good and excellent athlete? Well, you need to practice, right? You need to do the same thing over and over and over and over and over until it becomes second nature, until you can do it without thinking. Now, you start off having to sort of concentrate, right? So, imagine that I'm standing up here holding a baseball bat, right? What are the things that I need to do? Well, I need to keep my chin down, right? I need to make sure my stance is proper, right? I need my elbow up. I need to make sure that my swing is level. All of these things have to be going on, right, as I'm practicing them, as I'm learning how to have the proper form. But ultimately, it's got to get implanted in me in such a way that I swing the bat correctly without thinking. It's got to become second nature. It's the same thing with the vices and the virtues. Virtues are these traits that perfect their possessor. Vices are these traits that destroy their possessor. But you don't have a virtue and you don't have a vice until it has become firm and settled within you, until it has become second nature. This is good news for you. The reason this is good news is that most of you are simply not old enough to have virtues or vices at all. You haven't been living long enough. You haven't been doing the same thing over and over and over and over again for enough time for it to have become second nature to you. That's great news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is it's almost guaranteed that you are right now engaging in activities, developing habits that if you persist in them, they will become vices. Now, you might also be engaging in behaviors that if you persist in them, they become virtues. But you got to keep this in mind. You don't have the vice until it's become so deeply implanted in you that it's second nature, that you do it without thinking. It becomes like speaking your first language. For most of you, your first language is probably English. For some of you, your first language might be Spanish or some other language. But think about what that means. I don't have to tell myself, okay, don't forget to speak in English in this context. English just comes right out naturally. I don't have to think about it. That's what it is to actually have the vice. You just do the thing naturally. That's the idea. So you got to keep this in mind. Now, how do you get the vice? Well, repeated activity, repeated behavior that increases our proficiency at the activity, and it gradually forms our character. If it's a vice you're getting, it will gradually destroy you. If it's a virtue that you are acquiring, it will gradually perfect you. Now, look, in order for us to acquire a virtue, we often need external incentives and sanctions, right, to get us over the hump of acquiring, of doing these practices for their own sake, right? So it may be that in order to get you to go to piano practice, right, that I have to bribe you in some way if I'm your father, right? I might say afterwards we'll get some ice cream. But the hope is that at some point along the way, maybe after a year, 2 years, 3 years, you will start seeing, grasping, appreciating the beauty, the wonder, the benefit of learning how to play the piano, and you'll want to go. I won't have to force you to go anymore. In that way, the piano practicing, developing into a piano player, in that way, it's becoming part of who you are. That's also the case with the virtues and the vices. It has to be the case that it doesn't require external incentive, or it doesn't require sanctions or bribery or whatever for you to do the virtuous behavior. You don't have the virtues until you sort of do them because you see they are worthy of being done. That's the idea. It just comes naturally to you. You just see what needs to be done and you do it. Same thing with the vices, though. And here's the idea. When you have the vice deeply implanted in your nature, it now becomes something that you do unthinkingly, unreflectively. You do it and it doesn't pain you anymore. Maybe at first when you were engaging in this behavior, you've thought like, ooh, I don't like this. It feels bad. And then, after repeated behavior, it no longer feels bad. My brother-in-law, terrible human being. He was basically my father. He helped to raise me. Came into my life when I was very young, about 5-6 years old. And super bad guy, blah, blah, I could go into all sorts of details about him. But I remember one day when I was young, I wasn't a believer. I was at this party and some crazy stuff happened, blah, blah, blah. And I called him afterwards in tears. And I had done something that I had never done before. And I called him up and I said, I told him what I did through crying. He laughed and he said, oh, ha, ha, ha. He said, don't worry about that. He said, I know you feel bad, but let me tell you, just do it again and again and again, and you'll no longer feel bad about it. That was his advice to me. In many ways, he was quite right. I did engage in those behaviors over and over and over again, and I no longer felt bad about them. That's what happens as you acquire a vice. You start to see these destructive things as actually being enhancing things, as being good things, desirable things. So as we move through this discussion, right, we've got to keep these sorts of things in mind. You right now are not old enough, most likely, to have acquired a virtue or a vice. But you've got to be careful because very good chance that you are engaging in behaviors that will, if repeated, result in you having that vice, acquiring the vice where it becomes part of your nature. And remember, vices necessarily destroy. So we're going to be studying the vices over the next few lectures in order to identify these behaviors. You don't have the vice yet, remember, but we want to identify the behaviors that lead to them.